to the Blue Trails Guide November webinar. My name is Faye Augustin, and I'm really pleased to have you all join us this month as we learn how to activate your constituency to identify community-led water supply solutions. A couple quick things before we get started. Technical support issues. As many of you know with webinars, there is usually about a 3 to 5 second delay, so we appreciate your patience as we move the slides forward. Additionally, if your connection is lost at any time during the webinar, you can go ahead and log in using your unique web link and passcode that was provided to you when you registered with GoToWebinar. As always, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available for viewing next Monday, November 21st at bluetrailsguide.org/blog. We'll also send out an email with that link individually to everyone. And if you have any questions for me throughout the webinar or after the webinar is over, please feel free to reach out. My contact information is at the bottom of the screen. Then finally, questions and answers. We encourage you to ask any and all questions throughout the webinar that you may have. You've got a question box in the side panel of your GoToWebinar screen, and you can go ahead and type in your questions into the question box. We'll leave about 5 minutes at the end of the webinar to answer as many of those questions as we can. And then those questions that are not answered, we will take time and answer them after the webinar, and they will also be available on the blog with the recorded webinar, again, on Monday, November 21st, bluetrailsguide.org/blog. So without further ado, I'm really excited to get into our Blue Trails Guide presentation this morning. We have Jennifer Schoonen with the Blackfoot Challenge. She is their water steward, and she is also, the Blackfoot Challenge is also a Connecting Communities to Rivers grantee of American Rivers, and we've been so pleased to work with them over the last year, and I'm really excited to have Jennifer share more about the tremendous work that they're doing in western Montana. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jennifer. Thank you.
Thanks, Faye, and hi, thanks everyone for the opportunity to speak today. As Faye mentioned, my name is Jennifer Schoonen. I work as the Blackfoot Water Steward with the Blackfoot Challenge based in Ovando in the west central part of Montana. In working with our watersheds landowners and conservation partners, part of my role includes coordinating the Blackfoot Drought Response Plan and the committee that implements that plan. So I appreciate the opportunity to share our process with you and look forward to answering your questions at the end. The first thing I want to talk about a little bit is just give you a sense of our watershed size and location. So this is a map of Montana, shows where we're located. Our watershed covers about 1.5 million acres. Within there we have 1,900 miles of perennial streams and a 132-mile stretch of the big Blackfoot River that extends from the Continental Divide down to the confluence with the Clark Fork outside of Missoula, Montana. When you start to talk about coordinated water and drought management, this map is one tool we revert back to that kind of makes you realize what a challenge that could be, and probably not a different graphic from what you might see in many other watersheds. The many colors illustrate the broad mix of land ownership and management entities throughout our watershed, from private agricultural owners to corporate timber ownership to state and federal agencies of all kinds. In addition to that ownership diversity, we deal with a great diversity of natural resources and diverse value systems regarding the management of those resources. Our watershed is home to all the fish and wildlife species that Lewis and Clark would have encountered on their journey through in the early 1800s. So wolves and grizzly bears, a recently reintroduced population of trumpeter swans, and endangered bull trout in our rivers. So in looking back at the history of how we got to where we are with coordinated drought management, the first important event in our history is the passage in 1971 of a state water right that we call the Murphy Right. In that year, Montana Fish, Life, and Parks acquired in-stream flow water rights on 12 streams across the state to preserve fish and wildlife habitat. In the Blackfoot, that right exists to protect West Slope cutthroat trout and bull trout specifically. And this right will eventually, several decades down the road, become the driving force behind a voluntary and collaborative drought response effort in the Blackfoot. It's important to note, and we'll talk more a little bit about this later, that this right is junior, fairly young in the scheme of prior appropriation and Western water law, to the many large water rights in the Blackfoot, some of which date back to the 1880s and 1890s. Therefore, there are many water rights holders in the Blackfoot who would not be subject to a call on their water from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks based on that 1971 priority date. So we'll talk a little bit more about how we deal with that later. The next important event leading up to drought response for our watershed is in the late 1980s. We saw the first major extended drought following the implementation of that Murphy right. This was the first time that Mother Nature really prompted Blackfoot communities to rethink what they might be facing with the combination of extended drought and the state water right in place to protect fisheries. So this is an important period of sort of communities starting to think about what the impacts might be in an economy that's largely agriculture and recreation based and depends on that river. The next important date comes in 1992. That year, American Rivers included the Blackfoot on its annual list of the country's 10 most endangered rivers. This was another important call to action for our communities related to the health not just of the big Blackfoot River, but also all the important tributaries that feed the Blackfoot and support spawning habitat and year-round habitat for cutthroat and bull trout. So in response, our community members, local landowners largely led this effort, got together for a series of community meetings with the idea that voluntary community conservation would be a far better option than regulation of some kind. Those meetings led to the formation of the Blackfoot Challenge in 1993. Our name arose from one community member's reaction to that ownership map I showed earlier, when she said what a challenge it would be to coordinate natural resource response and stewardship across such a diverse ownership. So this is kind of the early beginnings of how our process would eventually form. So that process that bubbled up from those early meetings became the foundation for how the Blackfoot Challenge operates overall across all programs and would eventually become the foundation for drought response. It includes some important values we focus on. One is an open process. Anyone is invited to participate. Two, it's very consensus-based, so decisions must be fully agreed upon by all committee members involved. And we do our work through community-based committees with a diverse representation of stakeholders on those committees. So we have a committee for weeds and wildlife, committee for water, obviously. The stakeholders and committee members are the decision makers, and the challenge merely operates as the coordinating entity. We make sure those solutions are built from the community ideas, ground up, not top down, to build and maintain trust. So another round of drought and concern about the impacts of the Murphy right came about in around 2000, the early 2000s, and that prompted Blackfoot communities to start thinking about a new way to respond to drought. In 2000, stakeholders got together to write the Blackfoot Drought Response Plan and form a committee to help manage and implement that plan. Today, that committee meets year-round and intensively meets all spring and summer. Particularly during drought years, they'll meet weekly throughout the summer. The committee membership includes representatives from the Montana Department of Natural Resources, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and then of course the local ranchers and landowners, fishing outfitters, and then our nonprofit partners like Trout Unlimited and the Nature Conservancy. Some basic tenets of the plan. So the plan was developed as an alternative to traditional enforcement of the Murphy right as a water right. It's based on the concept of shared sacrifice, so sharing the burden of a low water year more broadly across the shoulders of the many users of the watershed. Today we like to kind of refer to that as shared giving, and everybody's giving a little bit back. It depends on all users, including irrigators and anglers, taking actions that will result in water savings and or the reduction of stress to native fish during drought. The individual participants from the irrigator community each have an individualized plan that's custom to their water rights, their agricultural operations, their irrigation system, and the streams and rivers from which they derive their irrigation water. And those individual plans are put into place with working directly with each individual landowner. So a little bit about how the process works in a drought year. By late spring, the Drought Committee begins meeting regularly to evaluate predicted water supply conditions. When we see a potential drought year on the horizon, we begin communicating with irrigators and fishing outfitters pretty early. By late winter or so, we'll often host a public meeting to give a water supply report, and we send out monthly water supply reports and updates frequently. Irrigators are asked in the spring to confirm that their current individual water conservation plan is accurate and that they will participate when they're asked should we hit drought response triggers. It's a pretty intensive coordination process, so by May the committee is meeting every couple weeks and moves to weekly meetings during a drought. The plan itself outlines both stream flows and water temperatures that will be evaluated as triggers for drought response. So we have a USGS gauge near the confluence of the Blackfoot and the Clark Fork outside the town of Bonner. When that gauge reaches 700 CFS, the plan kicks into play. This is a number that was determined by Montana Fish, Life, and Parks in the 1960s as a minimum to maintain the blue ribbon fisheries in our watershed based on the wetted perimeter of the river. Regular communication with the public and our plan participants takes place with specified conservation actions requested at 700 CFS, at 600, at 500, and then on. There are also temperature triggers in place for the bull trout tributaries that we have. It's a very important fishery, and so when waters warm up, we work with Fish, Life, and Parks, and the committee does, to implement potential fishing restrictions, or either partial closure or full closure depending on the conditions. The committee, the Drought Committee itself, retains some flexibility in implementing the plan. So if, for example, we hit that 700 CFS flow trigger in mid-September and we know irrigation demands are decreasing and fishing is declining and there's rain and cool weather predicted, the committee will usually forego drought action. That's part of the value of the plan. But for example, in 2015, we had something of the opposite happen. In early July, we hadn't hit our flow triggers, but the water got extremely warm extremely quickly. So at the urging of the Drought Committee, and particularly our fishing outfitting community, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks put hoot owl fishing restrictions into place a couple weeks before we actually saw the flow levels that led to irrigator water use restrictions. So an important piece of managing this process is just that flexibility. Some important considerations that each year, and as part of the language of the plan. Under the plan, Fish, Life, and Parks has agreed in partnership with us and the committee to not to initiate a call for water for any water rights that are junior to the Murphy right, where those water users have approved drought plans and participate voluntarily. The plan's success really depends, though, on both senior and junior water rights holders participating. As I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of large ag operations in our watershed, and many of those water rights are very senior to the Murphy right. So we seek sort of equity between the juniors and seniors, the small users and the large users, and ask as many irrigators as possible to participate. And we'll talk in a minute just about how we can motivate that participation. In addition to temperature and water flow triggers, the committee remains flexible in its decision making. So they consider the time of year, current water demand, what the resource conditions are, what the weather projections might be in making decisions about choosing to implement drought response and when. So it all seems like a pretty smooth process, but certainly there are challenges and benefits both each year, and we learn a little something new each year from implementing the plan. The benefits for landowners are pretty obvious. If Fish, Life, and Parks doesn't call for water from landowners with drought plans, if they have an accepted conservation plan in place, the plan helps us reduce that concern about pitting one group of stakeholders against another, either large operators against small operators or anglers against ranchers. So it tries to balance the sacrifice between all those groups. The response remains fluid and dynamic and is adapted every year based on unique and changing conditions. Our constant coordination and outreach helps people to have a voice and feel some ownership in the solution, so really a part of the program. And the plan outlines some really important sideboards to use in how we communicate a message of sharing this finite resource. All that said, the challenges, we see new ones every year. So certainly confusion among the general public about how our plan works requires a constant program of outreach and public education. Part of the confusion sometimes comes into play because different rivers in our watershed have different drought and fishing response measures at different times a year. So we try to work closely with our regional fish and wildlife staff just to make sure that we're coordinated with the Bitterroot and the Clark Fork and other rivers. It's a pretty labor-intensive process of validating irrigator plans and communicating with water users, so that takes quite a bit of our time as the coordinator of the program and funding and energy. And then just understanding water rights, they're complicated, so we are sort of always doing water rights education in one way or another. A big key we've talked about in recent years is how we better understand and quantify water savings. We don't, as some watersheds in Montana do, we don't necessarily have measuring devices on every ditch or every headgate, every stream. So we're looking at ways to better quantify exactly what we get during a drought year when we implement water conservation measures, and where we could do better. And then despite sort of the kumbaya discussion of fishing and ag working together, there are certainly those times when certain members of each community feel like the other community isn't fully doing their part. So after the extreme drought challenges of the last couple years, our drought committee is really realizing that we have to reassess individual drought plans and ensure there is true conservation value in each plan. Those plans do everything from a complete shutdown of water during drought to sort of a water trade, where they might trade some senior water for junior water, to maybe long-term mitigative actions, maybe a more efficient sprinkler system. So we're going to be evaluating what we get from all those options, and so that we can do a good job of designing drought plans in the future with our landowners. So I mentioned that, you know, not everybody has to participate. If you're fully fed by senior water rights, you don't necessarily have to participate in this program, but it really does depend on those senior water rights holders for us to make a difference during an extreme drought year like we've seen the last 2 years. So we really do our best to engage those senior water rights holders. We communicate often with them and ensure they're engaged in the process. In some cases, senior water rights holders have junior rights also, and their junior rights may be more vital to their operations, so they'd rather trade for the continued use of those rights and cut back on their seniors. So that's one way we get them engaged. We also have a strong just community ethic where we sort of, landowners, as one of our multi-generational ranchers says, does me no good to see my neighbors go out of business. That hurts our community, affects our schools, affects our post office, you know, affects our whole community. So there's a real strong feeling that it's in the interest to work sort of neighbor to neighbor to all protect and give a little something rather than have that burden be bigger on a smaller group of people. So this is sort of how we've been operating up till now, but we're really realizing that we have some changes in our future that we're going to have to address with more consistent drought happening and some changes in water rights. I won't delve into this issue too much, but just quickly, we are going to have a new in-stream flow right impact on our watershed that we are starting to partner with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, whose water compact was passed by the Montana State Legislature last year. That compact gave the Blackfoot and Upper Clark Fork some in-stream flow rights to the tribes with a new priority date that goes back to 1904. So obviously that's going to impact many more water users than our current 1971 priority date does. And so we're currently working with the tribes to engage them in drought planning, and we'll be reaching out to many more landowners to expand the scope of our drought response efforts with a whole new core of landowners. Blackfoot Drought Response is a process of continued outreach and education, and we've found that our diverse audiences demand information in different ways, and one of the biggest challenges is always making sure everybody knows what's happening. And so when you are in small rural communities, sometimes it's a poster in a post office or an article in the weekly paper that's most valuable. So we combine that with those outreach strategies with email and social media, try and reach everybody we can. We've gotten feedback from our most active irrigator participants in the last few years that they don't always feel that the recreating public and the angling community are aware about our shared sacrifice program or are doing much to support drought response. So on the slide there you'll see some of the strategies we've come up with. We put a series of drought alert signage around our fishing access sites in the watershed. This was with the support of American Rivers through our Connecting Communities grant. These are sort of like the fire danger signs you see the Forest Service puts out. We change out the flow level and just to alert people to what current flows are, and then there's information on the sign about how drought response works. And contained within the brochure holder is that Angling for the Future brochure that's shown there that provides tips to anglers about low-stress fishing techniques they can use when the water's warm and low to ease the stress on fisheries. For our irrigators, to help them prepare and plan ahead and hopefully not get caught off guard when we might be needing to shut down water later in the summer, we start issuing monthly water supply and stream flow forecast reports in late winter. And like I mentioned before, sometimes we'll host a public meeting and use a variety of tools to give them a heads up. One of the other programs we have tied to our drought response effort is an irrigation scheduling and efficiency program. So we provide technical assistance to improve both the electrical and water use efficiency of pumps and sprinkler systems. And we also send out a weekly irrigation water management report from the 1st of May through the end of September. Those reports include information about soil moisture, climate predictions, precip, crop water use and crop water needs and predictions for the next week to help irrigators sort of plan week by week on how to best use their water and sort of maximize their production while also maximizing their conservation of limited water resources in a dry year. We're also working to install weather and soil monitoring stations throughout the watershed to help feed information to that effort. And work on projects like irrigation system design that help improve the efficiency of those big systems around the watershed. And this graph I don't want to spend too much time on, but just is helping to inform us now. We're starting to see through tools we provide to our irrigators. This shows crop water use in over the course of several years, some drought years and then a non-drought year with 2011. But what we're starting to see is this real spike in crop water needs and a change in timing. So we're trying to help our irrigators plan ahead for years like this with tools that better alert them to the conditions of the both our river and stream flows and our soil conditions and predicted climate. And so one new direction for us is to look at soil health as a drought resiliency tool. So we have convened a new work group that's working together with our land and water stewardship programs to start looking at ways we can support soil health as a way to build in some drought resiliency. So we're exploring providing more outreach and education, piloting some soil health practices on the ground with a few willing producers and using those to educate their neighbors, and then doing some widespread soil testing just to test for organic matter and soil moisture holding capacity and tools that we can help inform producers to just better deal with less water in the future. The final piece of the puzzle is long-term conservation. We work closely with Trout Unlimited, with the Fish and Wildlife Service, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks on longer-term water conservation measures. And we recognize these as an important piece of an irrigator's annual drought response plan. So we have in-stream flow leases recognized in those plans, particularly for somebody who might be a non-traditional, not really an ag landowner, doesn't use irrigation water. We have a lot of tributary restoration projects going on. We've seen anecdotal evidence that those are feeding cold water into the larger system and really helping us during a drought year, keeping the river cooler. Work on irrigation delivery systems and efficiency of ditches and pipelines and things like that, and changes in long-term water management and use. One of the things the committee will be doing this year is really assessing how we measure the benefits of these projects in a drought year. What are they giving back, and how do we sort of provide a measurable, quantifiable benefit in terms of water quantity from those kinds of projects. But it's an important piece of the big picture moving forward. So that's it from me, and I'll just say quickly, I know that's a lot to run through in 20 minutes, so my email address is there, and I just welcome follow-up directly with me if folks have questions we can't get to today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that really helpful and thorough presentation of the work that you are doing on the Blackfoot. So at this point, we are opening the dialogue up for questions. We've got a couple in the question box now, but if you have a question for Jennifer, please feel free to go ahead and type it into your question box side panel, and we'll get to as many questions as we can in these last couple minutes of the presentation. Otherwise, we will have a transcript of all of the questions and answers available on the Blue Trail Guide blog next Monday, November 21st. So the first question that we have, Jennifer, is what are some of the ways that you've worked to reduce tension between recreation folks and the ag community?
Sure. That's a great question. One of the most important things is we recruit good leaders from both those communities to participate on the Drought Response Committee, and we work with those leaders to go back to their individual constituencies. So we have a really great fishing outfitter, for example, on our Drought Committee who is willing to kind of stand up and say, my community should do more. He's asked us to do a public meeting this year for the outfitters and guides so that he can kind of stand up in front of that community and talk about how he talk more about what he knows the irrigators are doing and present his ideas for how the fishing outfitters can participate better. And vice versa, we have landowners who have also love fish, and so we make sure that those are the ones that kind of help us stand up at a public meeting and say and demonstrate the benefits of both their long-term restoration projects and how they can strike this balance between cows and fish in a better way. Just to have that kind of leadership component is really important through the committee. We do a lot of outreach to the local media as well and try and get both those communities represented when we provide content for stories.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. The next question that we've got is around the recreation community and the specific strategies that you have worked to recommend for the angling community and how they can help when it relates to drought resiliency.
Yeah, so one of the things, certainly each year we deal with actual restrictions when there's a drought year, and that's something that's implemented by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. We don't deal with any sort of fishing restrictions or floating restrictions, but what we can do is educate folks about things like the types of fishing tackle that they should use that's lower stress, the types of ways to handle a fish, because our plan is largely focused on these sort of important fisheries, including an endangered species or a threatened species in our watershed. It's really important that we educate people. The signage we put out, I can't say enough about how we feel like we hit a new audience by getting brochures out to folks this year. We had put brochures in fly shops around town and hadn't had as much impact, but we're finally seeing by actually being on site at a river access point that we're reaching a lot more people. And again, we try and work through outfitters who are bringing out-of-state clients in and try and get those tips and techniques in their hands so they can be good advocates as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Jennifer. And I think we have time for one final question, which is, the last one is, how are some of the ways that you've identified the various solutions that you put into your drought resiliency plans? Were they through public meetings, or kind of what tactics and techniques did you guys utilize to identify those solutions?
Yeah, so everything we do happens through a public meeting and then ultimately committee meetings. And so this process originally started with public meetings, and then once there was a commitment to design a plan and a process, that happened through the Stakeholder Committee, and that committee exists today. I think we have about 25 members on that committee, and not everybody makes every meeting, but what we try to make sure is we have a well-rounded representation. Nothing gets done without full consensus of the committee. And that seems like a challenge. Some people think the consensus model is hard to achieve, but I think what we do is sort of zero in on what we know we can agree on and start there, and sort of leave the hard stuff behind initially so that we can work through and find some areas of agreement. So definitely the plan was a process and probably took longer than maybe had our organization just sat down and written it. But because it was a longer process and went through that community process, our community members seem more willing to participate and remain committed year after year.
That's fantastic. And with that, it is about 11:30 right now, Mountain Time. So I did want to thank you again, Jennifer, for your really fantastic presentation. And I would also love to thank all of our attendees this afternoon. It's been great to have all of you and your questions. As I mentioned earlier, this webinar is recorded and will be available next Monday, November 21st, on the Blue Trails Guide webinar. Blue Trails Guide website. And then I'd also encourage you to check back for our December Blue Trails Guide webinar, which will be focused on ecotourism and marketing recreation and conservation in your community. So check back on the Blue Trails Guide website for that in early December. Otherwise, thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your Tuesday, and we'll see you all back next month. Thank you again, Jennifer.
Thank you.